All right, thanks so much. I want to first of all acknowledge the great group at 6 Feet Up for hosting this really innovative conference. It's definitely the first conference I've ever attended, virtually or in person, where I've seen origami offered. So I thought that was really cool. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that the session provides some value for you. And as Jed said, please do feel free to capture any questions you have and bring them to our face-to-face session after. I'd be delighted to interact with you live. Now, I do want to give you a heads up that I'm going to make this interactive to the extent that we can, which means I'm going to just be asking you to think about some things and maybe jot some things down on your own as we go through, and it will help you get the most value out of what I'm sharing with you today. So again, I'm Dr. Atkison. I'm president of a company called ROI Communication Solutions, and I work with companies and organizations who want to use brain science to improve their communication and training efforts, which basically means I teach people tactics and strategies for communication and training that are grounded in what we know about how the brain actually learns. So the best part is not only are they grounded in brain science, which means we know they work, but they're also really easy to understand and employ. So what we have on deck today is that we're going to investigate your communication skills as they pertain to what I call your computer side manner. It's a little take on bedside manner. And I'm going to show you how you can use empathy and inquiry to improve your computer side manner. Now, my background is in the exact intersection of communication and how the brain learns. Before I became president of my consulting firm, I was actually an academic, so way back in a different life. So I have a PhD in human communication studies, and I was a communications professor and associate dean for a master's program at the University of Denver for many years. The program I taught for is geared toward working adults. So our courses used to be held in the evenings on campus. Now, about 20 years ago, I had been teaching at that point for about 4 years, and we started to play around with offering some courses online. Now, this was crazy back in the day, right? Now, of course, many programs are fully online or at least hybrid, but back in the day, this was a pretty, a unique concept. We really thought we were ahead of the game. So one day during this time, I was having a conversation with a professor in a department at the University of Denver that was called Digital Media Studies, and his name was Jeff. And Jeff asked me how I felt about the fact that we were going to begin offering online courses. Now, as you can probably surmise from the title of the department he worked for, Digital Media Studies, Jeff was pro-IT. But I told him in no uncertain terms, I was not a fan. I had absolutely no desire to teach any online courses, not now, not ever. And he asked with genuine curiosity, why not? And I said, because Jeff, I teach human communication. That means I study and teach how humans communicate and interact with each other. And without missing a beat, he said, that is how humans communicate and interact with each other. And I went, oh my gosh, he's right. Oh no. So I made up my mind right then and there to learn to teach online and to do it well, because I never wanted the online medium to be a barrier to ensuring that my students were actually learning. Now, I want to start by asking you a self-assessment question. I won't actually ask anybody to share your answer, but I do want to ask you to legitimately consider it. In fact, if you have a pen or pencil handy or you're taking notes electronically, go ahead and capture your answer for your own edification. And the question is this: on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, how would you rate your own communication skills? 1 to 10, 10 being the best. How do you really honestly rate your own communication skills? And how confident are you in that number? And let's see if that confidence level stays as we continue through our talk today. Now, you may be asking yourself or me in your mind, well, Allie, what do you mean by communication skills? How I talk to others in person, how I listen in person, how I talk to others in Zoom meetings, how I listen in Zoom meetings. Let's see, how I communicate by email, how I communicate by Slack or Teams, how I update progress reports, how I update support tickets, how I write reports, create slide decks, present information in meetings. Yes, all of this counts as communication. And guess what? It all matters. Yes, all of it. Oh, I know what you're thinking. No, Slack and Teams don't count. Yes, they do. But we're going to put a pin in that. We'll come back to it in a minute. So the title of my talk today is How's Your Computer Side Manner? And I named it that because nowadays we cannot separate the way we communicate electronically with the way we communicate in person. Your communication is a holistic picture of who you are. So, what does your communication say about you? Think about it. Your communication is your brand. And there's no point at which this is not true. Most people nowadays only know you virtually. And so the way you communicate is your brand, because people have accepted that nowadays, when you think about like the way companies are expected to show up, people have accepted that there's little to no delineation between personal and professional personas, right? People want to see individuals and companies as genuine and authentic. Well, the same line has been removed between how people communicate in person and how people show up online. You have to talk the talk and walk the walk. I cannot tell you how many times I have had people complain to me about how horribly other people communicate, only to turn around and communicate poorly to me themselves. Honestly, it's probably countless. And I think it's because people really fail to understand that communication truly is a holistic concept. It's about how you approach your interactions with other people every single time. Let's look at some numbers to give this stuff some legs, okay? First of all, research studies from Harvard University, the Carnegie Foundation, and Stanford Research Center have all found that 85% of job success comes from quote unquote soft skills like communication, while only 15% of job success comes from technical skills and knowledge. Folks, this is true even in IT fields. Think about how many startups don't make it. If you drill down, you'll see that the majority of the time, it's not that the idea or the concept behind the business wasn't solid. It's that the IT guru who had the initial idea didn't have the communication and leadership skills, of which communication, of course, play a critical component, to lead the company well. And the ones who do make it either do so because they're smart enough to either hire good people to help with employee management and communication, or they themselves do have strong communication skills. In fact, Entrepreneur magazine calls poor communication one of the top 5 reasons why startups leaders fail their companies. And Steve Wozniak said in an interview that one of the main reasons for Steve Jobs' success with Apple was his, quote, relentless drive to become a better communicator. Because Steve Jobs knew how critical it was to motivate and inspire his employees. When asked what best defines the gap in the US workforce skills gap, 42% of managers surveyed named soft skills, while only 22% named technical skills. And let's think about the impact that these gaps in communication skills have in and on organizations. 400 surveyed corporations estimated that communication barriers alone cost the average organization $62.4 million a year in lost productivity. That is staggering. A business with 100 employees spends an average of 17 hours a week clarifying communication. This amounts to an annual loss of over $528,000. That's if the business only has 100 employees. 86% of employees and executives cite the lack of effective collaboration and communication as the main causes for workplace failures. 86%. And 80% of employees say that effective communication is a major factor in building trust in their employer. However, only 32% of employees rate their leaders' communication positively. And without that trust, approximately 50% of employees will actively search for another job. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, but these are broad-based statistics. And I get that. It can be really hard sometimes to locate yourself in specific data like this. So let's look at it this way. Research also illustrates time and time again that your communication skills say so much more about you than you realize, and likely more than you intend. People make inferences about you based on your communication skills, and unfortunately, these inferences can be negative. People make inferences about your level of education, your level of intelligence, your pride in your work, your credibility, your business expertise. And again, this is all about inferences, but you may have an advanced degree and be an expert at what you do, but if you can't articulate that, it does no good because people only have one thing to go on, which is how you communicate those things. And here's the thing, folks. In today's litigious and divisive culture, most people won't tell you that your communication skills need work. They'll just change how they interact with you. I want you to think back over the span of your working life. How many resumes have you sent out that you just never got a response to? This is a real example of a resume I actually received once. Notice that she calls attention to her superior attention to detail. And then 2 lines below that makes a typo. Attention to detail, I don't know about that. Now, you may ask, wait a minute, people will seriously discount what otherwise might be a good candidate over one typo? Yes, some people really will. But let's look way past resumes. Think of how many other possible opportunities didn't come to fruition for you and you didn't know why. So again, think back over the span of your working life. Really close your eyes if you have to and think back over the span of your professional life. How many times have you sent an email to someone about an opportunity that never came to fruition? Maybe one that might have moved you ahead. How much time has been wasted because someone has asked you, or you had to ask someone else, to revise, clarify, or explain something that was written? How many times has someone responded to you to say something like, I asked you 3 questions and you only answered 1 of them? How many times did a situation with a colleague or client escalate due to your words? And here's the big one. Have you ever felt that your potential just isn't being recognized? Maybe you knocked an API out of the park, or you finished a brand new integration that was really unique, but these things didn't seem to move the needle with your boss. Or perhaps you feel you've just languished too long in the same role and feel your seniority or skill should have earned you more advancement. It is wholly likely that these are because you didn't effectively articulate the value of those things. In fact, if you said yes to any of the questions I've asked, then it's likely that your communication skills have had an impact on you and your professional career in a way you might not have realized. And when I say communication skills, again, I don't just mean a strong resume. As I said earlier, we are looking at a 360-degree view of your communication. What I really mean is how you articulate your thoughts in every context, how you show up as a communicator. Communication is ubiquitous, and yet it's something that we give too little thought to, most of us. And when we do, we rationalize. We tell ourselves all kinds of myths and stories about why it's okay that we take this approach. So let's take a look at the top 5 myths about communication. Now, most of these are pretty universal, but there are a couple in here you may recognize as particularly relevant to the IT field. The first myth: I'm in IT. It doesn't matter how well I communicate, only how well I code. A colleague of mine, let's call him Julius, was in an IT leadership position for a company on which he supervised a team of about 12 developers. And one of his developers, in Julius's own words, wrote beautiful code, but they had to fire him anyway. Why? Because this developer, let's call him Bert, suffered from poor communication skills. And his skills hurt the team. He was one of those head down kind of workers, right? I'm sure you know the kind. Great when you're coding, but not so much because he couldn't properly articulate what he was doing in a way that helped the rest of the team. And if the rest of the team doesn't understand what Bert is doing, they can't do their jobs properly either. So not only did he not help the team, but he actually impaired them in their progress. He didn't recognize, despite coaching, that being on a team involves communication so the team can work as a team. He kept his communications too infrequent, too reactive. That is, he was never proactive in communicating, but only reactive to others' communication. And when he did communicate, it was sort of monosyllabic and lacked both clarity and context. So despite the fact that Bert was a, quote, beautiful coder, he was let go. So communication isn't just about writing things without typos. We're talking about what I named my talk. We're talking about computer side manner. This is about, again, how you show up in your computer mediated communication. And trust me, how you communicate may matter less to you than it should or could, but it matters a whole lot to your peers and your leadership. Myth number 2, I am communication doesn't count. It's just a Slack message. It's just team. Who cares? I'll tell you who cares. The person on the receiving end who is put off by the abruptness or confused by the total lack of context. It is time in this day and age to stop treating instant messages as though they don't count as communication. The medium has nothing to do with the importance or the efficacy of your communication. Now, is it okay to communicate in more of a shorthand? Oh, sure, of course, absolutely. But it's not okay to type IMs that are succinct to the point of being rude or that lack clarity to the point of being confusing. Now, that's the second time I've referenced clarity and context. Maybe those are pretty important. Myth number 3, people can figure out what I mean. My partner and I just built a house. This is a real excerpt from a real email exchange I had with a vendor we were trying to work with. I'm going to give you just a second to read this whole exchange. And this exchange represents only about 1% of the very frustrating exchanges I had with this person. So the outcome, neither my builder nor I will ever work with this person again. And I tell you, I will tell anyone who'll listen that they shouldn't either. Your clarity matters. Why? Because when you aren't clear, you waste other people's time, and ain't nobody got time for that. A colleague of mine, let's call her Lauren, is a technical trainer for a manufacturing firm. She told me about an email she received from her supervisor. He forwarded her an article from a local business journal, and the only words he had written in his email were, "Lauren, you need to do something about this." She was concerned right away because his words seemed to suggest that one or both of the following were true. A, she had something to do with the issue in the article, and B, she was responsible for fixing it. Well, it turns out that the article examined 2 local manufacturing firms that produce the same type of product, and one was the firm Lauren worked for, and the other was their biggest competitor. The article talked about the fact that the other firm had made it a point that all of their employees, not just the leadership, but everyone, should become well-versed in their competitors' products, with the perspective that this knowledge would help them understand how to sell and manufacture their own products even better. And the president of the other firm in the article was quoted as saying, "Nothing against our competition, but I don't think anybody else is doing that." So when Lauren's boss said, "You need to do something about this," she didn't know whether to be hurt by his seeming allegation that she was somehow part of the problem, or confused by what it was exactly he wanted her to do about it, or both. It turns out that what he meant was that he wanted her to create a training on the value of understanding the competition's products and processes. But that was not at all clear from his email. Now, of course, they eventually figured it out, as people usually do, but not without wasted time and some relational difficulty involved. So the myth, people can figure out what I mean, well, maybe, maybe not. But even if they can, you waste their time, which risks damaging your credibility, and you risk damaging the relationship. Now, his tone in that email was another thing entirely, which leads me to my next myth. Myth number 4, my tone doesn't matter. They know I mean well. People know me better than that, right? No, they don't. I'm in a networking group. There's a woman in the group, let's call her Esther, with whom I have a very good relationship. And she had asked me to do her a favor on a particular date. I said yes, but later realized I had double booked myself. I really didn't want to text her with the bad news that I couldn't get out of the other thing. So I called her, I left her a voicemail explaining the situation, and I offered to still do the favor if we could just move the date, which was actually in Esther's control. I got a terse text from Esther about an hour later that said simply, "Don't worry about it." Ouch. It seemed that she was pretty upset. So I texted back, "Could we talk?" No response. I texted again. "You seem upset. I do want to help. I'm so sorry. Let me know your thoughts about my suggestion to move the date." Her response, "I'm not upset, just busy." No punctuation, no capitalization. Again, ouch. I had to wait almost a week to see her in person, during which time I was really emotionally distressed, thinking that she was upset with me. And when I saw her a week later, she came up smiling and hugging. Oh, okay, so I didn't misread her text. Phew. But she left me emotionally drained from worrying about it for so long, when simply paying more attention to how her messages were coming across would have set my mind at ease. If you think people are just supposed to know you well enough to know you mean well and always assume positive intent, think about this. How many times has your significant other said to you, "Are you mad at me?" or "What's bugging you?" when absolutely nothing was wrong? How many times have you said that to them? If you two don't know each other well enough to be 100% confident in positive intent all the time, why would you assume your colleagues do? Myth number 5. It doesn't matter if I'm present in a Zoom meeting because, myth number 6, I'm good at multitasking. I know. I said top 5 myths, but I'm lumping these two together because they're distinct and they're inextricably linked. So I get by on a technicality on this one. When I was in academic leadership, I was in a Zoom meeting with the team I supervised, as well as an assistant dean in our department. And the assistant dean, Deborah, had just been told that my team was going to hit pause on one aspect of a plan that we'd been talking about, but we were going to move forward with the rest of the plan. And she explained why, and then she went around to each member of my team to ask each person directly whether they had any questions or concerns. When she got to the team member I supervised named Connor, which was at least 5 people later, it was clear he had not remotely been paying attention. And when she asked him if he had any questions or concerns, he stammered, well, I guess. And then he proceeded to ask her if there were any updates on the exact part of the plan she just explained we were hitting pause on. Clearly, it made him look terrible in front of everyone, and it created a total lack of trust and credibility in him in her eyes. Now, I bet this faux pas resonates with a lot of people. I won't even feign total innocence here. I teach communication skills, and I may have attended to another task or two during a Zoom meeting. And here's the thing, we are all overwhelmed these days. We all have too much to do. And we think if we can just do this one little thing during this meeting, we'll be so much less stressed. Just get this one thing off our plate. But here's the thing, you won't be less stressed. Research reveals a few really important things about multitasking. Number 1, you're not good at it. In fact, you're not even capable of it. No one is. No matter how hard you try to convince yourself, the whole concept of multitasking is a myth. The brain is simply not capable of attending to 2 cognitively complex tasks at the same time. Now, notice I said complex tasks. Things like listening, reading, writing, talking. These take more cognitive energy than, say, doodling or twirling your hair or tapping your foot. Now, what does happen is what's called task switching. So we are in effect not actually doing 2 tasks at once, but rather switching back and forth between 2 or more tasks quickly. Now, some researchers believe that it's possible the brain could be trained, and we're talking, by the way, over generations, not a few years, to task switch more effectively, but even that is debated for now. What researchers do agree on is that our brains are biologically incapable of processing attention-rich inputs simultaneously. In other words, although we fool ourselves into thinking we're multitasking because we're technically doing more than one thing, we aren't doing any of them very well. And we're certainly not creating any neural connections. In layperson's terms, that means we're pretty much incapable of effectively analyzing, assessing, evaluating, remembering, learning, or even frankly, listening well in those moments when we think we're multitasking. The second thing to understand about multitasking is that we do it for the most part, like I said, because we think if we can just knock one more thing off our plate, we'll be less stressed. Guess what? Not true. Research reveals that multitasking actually adds to your stress level because it increases cortisol and adrenaline, not to mention it weakens memory and creativity. And get this, it actually temporarily decreases your IQ while you're doing it. That does not sound good to me. Now, before I move to the third thing to understand about multitasking, let me ask you to take a guess at something. I can't really police whether you Google this, but I hope you won't. Just take a guess at it in your own mind. What do you think the average human attention span is? Now, I ask this because I suggest that we don't always multitask because we're trying to accomplish things. I think sometimes we do it because we give ourselves the excuse that we have short attention spans. But it turns out that my question to you was a bit of a trick question. If you're telling yourself that it's okay to multitask because you just have a short attention span and can't possibly be expected to pay attention to something for that long, well, that's a myth, because the truth is that the whole notion of attention span at all is a myth. Maybe you've even heard the ones about how humans now share the same attention span as the average goldfish. The truth is, attention is selective, period. Dr. Gemma Briggs, a psychologist who studies attention at the Open University in London, notes that the whole notion of a, quote, average attention span is a total myth. Attention is actually task dependent, and it has everything to do with the extent to which a person is motivated to selectively attend to something. Oh, by the way, as a quick and humorous aside, Simon Mabin of the BBC World Service found an expert on fish behavior, yes, that's a thing, who says that goldfish are actually quite capable of memory and learning and do not, in fact, have short attention spans either. Now, it is true that in today's digitally polluted world, there are more things competing for our attention, for us to select to attend to something, but attention is a choice. So you can choose to focus on certain things, and you can also choose to turn off things that compete for your attention, those devices and alerts and tools that create distractions for you during meetings or in other times. It's a choice to be present. It's not an accident not to be. Now, all of these myths can be addressed by employing what I call the new EI, not emotional intelligence, but rather empathy and inquiry. Now, these are not characteristics. These are not something you were born with or not. These are strategic choices. They're skills that you can absolutely build. So let's break this down. When I talk about empathy, I'm not suggesting some way you should be as a human. Oh, be more empathetic, just be more empathetic, have more feelings. Rather, what I mean by empathy is that when you communicate, it's incumbent upon you to consider the impact of your communication on the other person. Now, this includes whether it makes sense, whether it's timely, whether it's too wordy or maybe too abrupt, or what the tone is. You need to consider the impact of your communication on the other person, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, although it is, but more so because it's the right strategic choice to improve your communication. Now, let's look at this from a purely scientific perspective in terms of how our brains are actually wired. I want to give a quick caveat that this is a pretty broad oversimplification and high-level overview of neuroscience for time's sake. But for now, you can think of the brain as comprised of trillions, yes, trillions of tiny little storage cubbies, kind of like how I picture an Amazon warehouse. Each thing you've ever learned is stored in one of these cubbies. And anytime you encounter new data or new stimuli out there in the world, your brain immediately starts searching your existing cubbies to ask, how is this new thing like something I already know? But the world is full of stimuli, way too much for our brain to attend to all of it. So when stimuli enter our brain in the form of an electrical impulse, we don't process all stimuli the same way. Some data or stimuli is processed with a low-level, weaker signal, and some with a high-level, stronger signal. Now, the latter will result in a stronger synaptic connection, which is more likely to be stored as memory or knowledge. Okay, so what makes the difference in whether we process incoming data with a strong or a weak signal? Well, what makes the difference is prior experience or prior knowledge with that data. Prior experience with or prior knowledge about incoming data leads to a stronger synaptic connection to that data. Less or no experience leads to a more feeble connection. So to put this all in the simplest terms with regard to this talk and what you need to know, when you communicate with other people, if you cannot somehow connect what you're saying, written or verbal, to something that already exists in one of their little cubbies, it will not land with them. They will ignore it. It will create confusion. They'll forget it, any and all of those above. So this means it is always 100% of the time, regardless of the medium, text, IM, email, in-person, Zoom, etc. It's your responsibility as the communicator to provide clarity and context to create pathways between what you're saying and what already exists in one of their little cubbies. A former boss of mine some years ago frequently neglected to provide clarity or context in pretty much all of her communication. In fact, I sometimes legitimately believed that she thought I could read her mind. She would email me things like, did you get to that yet? And I had a dozen tasks on deck on any given day and dozens per week. So to what does that refer? Or she would IM me and say, or I'd IM her and say something like, do you want me to edit that report for you now or when you include the future projections? And she would respond with either just yes or something completely unrelated, like, I think Terry wants to be included in that meeting. Okay. Sometimes examples like these are funny, but not usually until later. In the moment, they're usually frustrating and they waste time and again, risk damaging the sender's credibility. Imagine that I'm your boss and consider the following IM exchange. You say, I think I found something. And I think, okay, a hair in your food, Bigfoot, the meaning of life. What did you find? So instead, respect my time by taking a bit more of your own and say something like, remember the meeting about the Jupiter project we had yesterday when you asked me if I could find some code to unblock us from moving forward? I think I found it. So when you're communicating with others, keep in mind there's no way to read your mind. Empathy in this context means you have to connect with other people, excuse me, not just in concept, but actually cognitively. Otherwise, their brains will just filter out your words as more of the digital noise we're all bombarded with every day. So how do you make those connections to what people already know? Well, there are lots of ways. And when I teach improved communication skills to my clients, I provide really detailed strategies specific to their needs. But for the short time we have together today, I'm going to give you my best tip, which is to use inquiry. Inquiry, when employed with empathy, will give you what you need to affect change in how you show up in all of your computer-mediated communication. So let's look at inquiry. And again, I'm using this strictly from a skills perspective. I'm not asking you to be a more curious person, although admittedly, if you are, you might have an easier time with this skill. But what I mean is grow your skill of learning to ask lots of questions. First, ask questions about your own communication. What might be misinterpreted about what you said, about how you said it, about why you left certain information out of what you said, about why you're off camera, or about why you're clearly doing something else while your colleague is talking, or what might be misinterpreted about why you haven't followed up with somebody in so many days or weeks. You can also ask questions like, what context or information have I neglected to provide? Going back to super old school, who, what, when, where, how, why. These are great, useful guidelines for questions. It doesn't mean you have to answer every single one of these every time you communicate, but they're useful guides for considering what information might be pertinent that you've left out that the other person needs to know. So again, ask yourself, what does the other person need to know rather than what do I feel like saying? Or even more egregiously, what do I think I have time to type? If I had time right now, ironically, I would have covered time as another myth, because saying that you don't have an extra couple of minutes up front to spare to communicate that, to ensure that your communication is clear, error-free, positive in tone, etc. Saying you don't have enough time to do that, actually, it's bullshit. And the reason I say that is because you'll actually save not only yourself, but everyone else time down the road if you take a little bit more time now to edit your communications, whether it's 2 words or 200, to ensure clarity and context. Okay, I digress. But back to asking questions about what information you may have neglected to provide. It's especially important to inquire into what you haven't said, because very often the missing information is actually where the lack of clarity comes from. Sometimes more than what you said, it's about what you didn't say. If you email me and you say, hey, I took care of that project, we're all set, I'm going to have a lot of questions about that. Which project? We have lots. All set? How exactly? What do you mean took care of it? Threw it away? So I want to know, I need information. So when you lead from a place of empathy and inquiry, you learn to start writing from your recipient's point of view rather than yours, and thus ask yourself questions about what's clear and unclear in each communicative utterance. I'll give you an example. My partner was going to take his oldest son shopping for new clothes for an internship he had just gotten, and he wanted to know if his 2 younger sons wanted to join them. So this is how he initially worded his text to his 2 younger sons. It said, hey, we're going shopping for new clothes on Saturday if you want to join us. Well, thank goodness I saw it before he sent it, because to me, there were 2 possible misinterpretations here. One, that he and I were going shopping for new clothes and we just wanted them to join us. And I don't know if you all have teenagers, but I'm guessing that 2 teenage boys don't think that sounds like a lot of fun to go shopping with 2 adults. to watch them buy clothes. The second possible misinterpretation I thought was that he was offering to buy all three of them new clothes, not just his oldest son specifically clothes for his internship. And that would have resulted in either our spending a lot more money than we had planned on, or in two very disappointed boys when they got there and realized, that my partner had to tell them what was actually going on. So I was able to ask him to reread the text for possible misinterpretations, and he had the opportunity then to clarify thusly. He said instead, "Hey, you two, I'm taking eldest son shopping for internship clothes on Saturday. Do you guys want to tag along?" Now, here's the cool thing about inquiry. Not only should you ask yourself questions about your own communication to amp up clarity and context, but you can also use inquiry to ask yourself questions about others' communication. When you get communication from other people that might be unclear, incomplete, hurtful, or otherwise bothersome, ask yourself questions like, what might I be misinterpreting? Is it possible they meant something different than how I'm taking it? The answer to that question is almost always yes, by the way. What could I ask to clarify something before jumping to conclusions? What could I ask this person in order to connect with them better? Or what information do I need that they haven't yet provided? So using inquiry in this manner will lead to improved relationships because it will help you avoid assumptions about others' communication, and it will help you in turn continue to ask more questions for clarification instead of proceeding on misinformation or missing information. So remember, attention is selective. If you use empathy and inquiry each time you communicate, again, regardless of context or medium, to ensure that you're engaged and that your messages are clear and succinct. You should do this not just because your recipient, not because your recipients have short attention span, but because your communication must connect to what they know and understand in order for their brains to selectively attend to it. Don't use mediated communication as an excuse to not bring your best self. Show up the same way in computer mediated communication that you would in person. If anything, I suggest you should pay more attention to computer mediated communication. The more you can avoid contributing to the digital clutter by being clear, taking the extra minute now to proofread, ensure clarity, etc., the more people will count on you as a partner, the more credible you'll be received, and the more you'll rise to the top. I mentioned at the beginning that your communication is your brand. Lita Citroen, who's a reputation management expert, has a great quote about this. She says, "Everyone has a brand by design or by default. Don't have a brand by default. Control your brand." How do you do that? By being strategic about your communicative choices every single time in every single context. So thank you so much for your time.